I am here with Kain, who's the founder of Synthetix and sort of big player in DeFi. Kain, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to see you.
Maybe we can start off by you giving a little bit of context on how you fell down the crypto rabbit hole and what the hell the last few years have been like for you.
Yeah, it was actually funny. I found something. So I was in online retail before crypto, and I found something. I've been on so many podcasts where I'm like, we launched this thing with like Coinbase Pay or whatever it was back in like 2012, where people still thought Bitcoin was going to be this payment mechanism, and that like no one used it, right? And it was like this thing that we tried and it didn't really work, and it was kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. But I ended up meeting some of the people who were in the crypto space back then who were like trying to like launch crypto payments. A guy named Asher Tan who went out to build like a big wallet, and some of the other ecosystem participants. But I actually found something like maybe a month ago. I don't know why. I was searching my iMessages for Bitcoin, and I got a message from Kieran, my little brother, who was like, oh my God, someone actually paid with Bitcoin. So someone actually paid with Bitcoin at some point in 2012 for like some audio interface or something like that. He didn't say how much it was or how many Bitcoin it was or whatever. Right? Like the average basket size on our site was probably like $500 to $1,000. So it's probably like 3 or 4 BTC, I'm guessing, right? That someone paid for stuff with. And we have no idea where it is. It's like in some Coinbase account somewhere that we don't know how to access or whatever. So there's like 5, talking about dead Bitcoin, there's like 5 Bitcoin somewhere that like someone paid for some music gear, and we don't know where it is.
I'm sure that person looks back on that moment and is like, damn, I did not need to be buying that in Bitcoin.
100%. Yeah. Ended up costing them, like $100,000 or something.
That is so funny. So that sent you down. Was that your first exposure to crypto?
No, I was kind of aware of it, I guess. And had dabbled in like Bitcoin mining and stuff. Like I was on Slashdot, the old like tech forum. And so I remember reading the Bitcoin, there was like a big thread, like a bunch of people. That was like the first time that they really came across it. It was like some upgrade to the software or something. And I like tried to set up CG Miner, couldn't set it up, couldn't get it working. It was like running on my home theater PC. It just wasn't a thing. And it probably like the thing that actually got me into crypto, I would say, is when I was building a payment gateway after shutting down the online retail business. I was building a payment gateway, and I realized that like there was this very adversarial relationship with the banks and crypto. I hadn't been really across it, and I was talking to some friends of mine who are in the crypto space, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we just can't get banked. It's really hard." And we were coming from a much more traditional space, and so we had no issues. We had this like very wealthy guy that's part of the Murdoch family that was like the lead investor in this project, and like kind of was the one who was kind of pushing it along. And he could get bank accounts wherever he wanted. And so like we had like multiple bank accounts in multiple different places. And these guys were like, we really need like to be able to access bank accounts. They were doing crazy stuff, like sending people in with like, an envelope with cash in it, like with the account number written on it that they would like give them. It was just insane to get money into the ecosystem at the time. And so we were like, oh, well, you can use our payment gateway. And so then we ended up launching, I think it was like 2015 or 2016, we ended up launching this payment gateway to allow people to buy Bitcoin, basically. And that was where I really went down the rabbit hole. I was like, okay, like there's a lot of people, we were doing like at first, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. At the peak in 2017, I think we were doing like tens of millions of dollars transactions a month. It was pretty crazy. So I was like, all right, there's something here. And that kind of led me really to go deeper into, specifically Ethereum.
And then from there, how did you get to Synthetix?
Well, again, I was in payments and online retail, right? And like, I still think that there was this sense of like crypto is for payments, right? Like that was my reading of the Bitcoin white paper was, crypto's for payments, right? It's a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, right? Like the idea was payments. It wasn't, digital gold or whatever crazy narrative we're going with, at the moment. And so I was like, okay, well, Bitcoin clearly didn't work, right? And I had like firsthand knowledge, right? And so I thought that no one had ever used Bitcoin to pay for anything on our website. Turns out they had. One person did, right? But or maybe more, honestly, like it says like someone actually did this, right? So it shows that I obviously had forgotten what was going on. So maybe there's like 50 people that paid with Bitcoin, who knows? But I had this kind of firsthand knowledge of like, no, this is not a thing. Like people don't use Bitcoin to pay for things for a whole bunch of reasons, volatility, et cetera. And stable coins, I guess, were BitShares was the only real example, I suppose, other than Tether, right? But like the idea of like a decentralized stable coin was around. Maker hadn't launched yet. And I was like, I think there's a way to do this differently, right? Like, I think if we make a payment system where people pay to transact, right? Instead of sending money around for free, you actually pay to transact, right? There's a fee every time you transfer funds that could pay for this payment network. It could kind of support itself, and you could have sort of a algorithmic stable coin that's based on transaction fees, essentially. And that was Haven. That was the original idea for Haven. It turns out there's a whole bunch of things that are wrong with that idea. And so, eventually we pivoted away from that, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, right? And it allowed us to raise some money and kind of get some momentum into the space.
What was that pivot like? I mean, how many pivots did you do from there to get to what Synthetix is now?
It was probably that one big pivot, I think, from, USD denominated stablecoin payment network to an exchange system. That said, in the white paper, we had actually contemplated the idea of like multiple currency stablecoins. But it was basically just using different oracles, right? It wasn't allowing them necessarily to be like traded between them. And certainly we hadn't thought about what the implications of allowing multiple, currencies, multiple stablecoins denominated in different currencies, would look like to actually enable that to work. Because when we actually said, let's do this, let's pivot to that, it took like 6 months to figure out how to do it. It was actually a nightmarish problem. It was funny. I met with one of the engineers who helped us with that yesterday, and he still remembers it. Like 5 years later, he's like, that was one of the worst ideation processes I've ever been through. Like there was one day where I think there were about 10 of us sitting in this tiny little room, and it was one of those like co-working space offices where they have just whiteboards around the entire wall, right? And I remember we sat there for like 5 hours, and we started on one wall, and we're writing out all these things and like coming up with the different options of like baskets of currencies, how it's going to be backed. And we just like went from wall to wall to wall to wall to wall, got all the way back around, and we're like, it can't work. And then we're like, all right, let's take a break, guys.
It's like that meme of like Charlie from It's Always Sunny with like all of the, what I'm talking about.
I'm sure someone has a photo of it. It was like just crazy scrolls of madness. And then we got to the end and we're like, no, it doesn't work. And we're like, okay, cool. let's go and sleep or something.
Solid.
Yeah.
I mean, on that note, like, I'm very curious. I think right now feels like a moment where a lot of companies are like questioning whether or not what they originally designed in these like highly complex protocols even works. I'm curious how you think about this idea of like pivoting or even understanding like, okay, is what we design not working because crypto adoption just sucks? Is it not working because it's a bad idea? I think oftentimes, I don't want to make accusations, but I do think that a lot of teams sort of hide behind this idea that like, oh, crypto adoption just isn't there, and so we just can't make this work. And so I'm curious how you think about that in general and like validating concepts in a world where we struggle with adoption.
Well, I think, I can kind of give this specific case of Haven, right? Like what was it that sort of indicated to us that this was never going to be a thing, right? This just was not going to work. And what it was charging fees as part of, so we built a non-standard ERC20, right? As if ERC20s were not problematic enough, right? We made it worse. And so we were like, okay, when you set, and when we were doing this, there were no contracts on mainnet doing anything really, right? So like we didn't have best practices of like how this was going to work, what the implications would be or whatever. And so we're like, okay, so you got all these things, and I remember there was like some example of like either Delta or something where there was an expectation when you sent in stable coins built into their system that the amount that was sent would be the amount that would arrive, right? Like just obviously, like it's just such a, kind of obvious thing to expect. And in our case, it wouldn't, because we would go, hey, we're sending you 100 of this thing and only 99.8 are going to arrive, right? And they were just like, no, we're not, like, sorry, this is just not a thing. We're not touching this. And so we're like, okay, well, the one place where you could actually use this to buy things says like, we won't use it, right? And so we just had to like figure out that that was not a thing. And so if you couldn't charge fees, you know, I remember there were a whole bunch of objections to Haven. Like one of them was like, people would just fork away the fees, right? No one's ever forked away fees. Like they forked for other reasons, but they don't fork away fees really. You know, there's not many good examples of that. But there were a lot of concerns, but this was like a very practical thing that like people wouldn't integrate it. And so we're like, okay, we can't charge fees on transfer. Like what could we do? And we, you know, considered things like having inflation and, you know, it all kind of ends up in the same sort of place where people have an expectation that a certain amount of tokens leaves a wallet and a certain amount of tokens gets to the wallet. And if you break that, you have problems, right? And, you know, then later, obviously with a lot of algo stable coins, it was like rebasing. And so there were problems with like, you have a certain amount of tokens in your wallet and you expect that that will stay the same, and then it doesn't, it changes. And so, you know, a lot of AMM pools were like, what are you people doing? Like, this is madness, right? So I think we just got to a point where like, this is not like it may be a viable in principle strategy, but it's not viable in practice to charge fees on transfer. Okay. And so if you can't charge fees on transfer, the whole thing falls apart. Like there's really no way to charge fees. And so then you need to work out something else. So what we said is, okay, let's charge fees when someone exchanges. All right. So we'll take the fees when someone exchanges. And so then what you get is, let's say, you know, even if you are interacting with an AMM pool, there isn't an expectation that, you know, one synthetic Bitcoin is going to end up with the same number of synthetic ETH at the end of the transaction, because they're different things, right? You're swapping between things. So then it became less of a problem. It was just the exchange rate between two tokens. And that was something that, you know, it was just all like, you know, exchange rates between tokens were something that the, you know, most contracts contemplated. And so it was fine. And so then we were able to do that. So I think my guess is there are probably a lot of projects out there that are kind of looking at some of the practical implications of these theoretical constructs that they you know, sold to the market, right? And going, oh, actually, yeah, that's you know, an implication we didn't expect, right? And if you have those and there's no way around it, you really need to start, you know, getting out your, you know, pivot cards and working out what you're going to do, right? If you're doing something which works as expected and does the thing that you said it would do, and there's no, you know, dire implications of any of the design choices you made or whatever, and no one's using it, it's kind of, you know, two components to that. Like one, maybe it's dumb, right? Like, and balance of probabilities are probably dumb, right? Like probably the market just doesn't want it, right? Like on some level, if you go out and build something, you're like, we think the market will want this, and then you build it and no one wants it, like probably there was a reason why no one built it before, right? Or, you know, oftentimes you even go and you look and you're like, oh, actually, if someone did build this before and they still didn't want it and they still don't want it now. Okay, so what do we do? What have we learned? You know, how do we find something that people would want? And you pivot that way. I think there are definitely cases where like people are building things and no one's using it, and it is because there just aren't enough users. Like if you're building for the wrong type of user, right? If you're building something for like the dumbest end user you can imagine, like those people got wrecked. They're already gone, right? So if you're like, I'm building something for like, you know, the like person who just has no idea about crypto, but for some reason wants to use it, you know, yes, there are none of those users around. And so maybe it's possible that your thing is a brilliant idea for those users, but that you just can't connect those two. You really need to be, I think the thing that I've been saying, I've got this new thing that I'm working on, and one of the guys that's working on it with me, I've been telling him every day, like, you really need to question your assumptions, right? Like you need a bunch of assumptions to go and do something. And the key thing is to just question those assumptions all the time. Not every assumption every day, because you couldn't live like that, but like enough assumptions at different times where, you know, again, like, is it a dumb idea to charge fees on transfer? Like that was an assumption, right? And if you never question that, you just keep doing it and you're like running into a brick wall and you're like, no, this, I'm not wrong. The market's wrong. Like this is the right thing to do. And eventually people will come around to it, right? And it's like, no, Like that was a dumb assumption. And it's okay. Like it's okay to make dumb assumptions. And so you just move on and you do something else, right? And so I think that being open to your prior assumptions before you did anything being wrong, and the likelihood of that being fairly high, will allow you to kind of see through the fog a little bit and find your way. But again, I do think, there's some really good examples of things that were obviously good in a market that was utterly terrible, like way worse than this. Uniswap is the best example, right? Like Uniswap probably launched at like the worst possible time, right, in the market. And it got tons of adoption because it was a really good thing that made a lot of sense. It took a little while. Like it didn't just like immediately blow up, right? Like there was a period where people were skeptical about whether Uniswap was even useful, right? There were definitely people out there who were like, I don't think this is a real thing, right? And then eventually it got enough momentum, people started using it, but it took a little while. It took maybe, 3 or 6 months before it was like, oh, wow, this thing really works.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, of course, it sounds like Haven was not decentralized at that time and governance was not a thing that was happening. But like in the context of all of this, I think testing assumptions requires shipping and seeing how the market reacts to some degree. And there's definitely a weird dynamic between decentralized governance and like a lack of flexibility. And so I'm curious how you think about that ability to like pivot and change approach in the context of this weird landscape that we've built where like teams are kind of decentralizing earlier than maybe they should and maybe giving up some flexibility there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think bear markets are nice because so few people care what you do, right? Like the majority of people have given up hope. And, like if you went back and looked at like your Discord, like 90% of those Discord people that were there 18 months ago are gone, right? And so you're kind of left with people who are implicitly more bought in and engaged and more open, open-minded, like open to like trying new things, right? And that's exactly what happened with Haven. The people who were left when we turned up, and yes, at the time Haven was a foundation, right? So it was an open source software foundation that was run by a group of people. It was absolutely centralized, right? Like that was the intent behind it. But it's not like we just did things and didn't consult with the community. It was a group of people, there was some people that were in a room doing some stuff, and then there were a whole bunch of people that were in Discord that were, sort of thinking about this problem, right? And when I came and proposed this pivot, and I think even the pivot to Synthetix was not necessarily the thing that worked, right? It was the pivot to an inflationary token model, which like that was controversial, right? At the time, it wasn't like that was just like a slam dunk. Everyone's like, oh yeah, of course, like just jack the token up, no problem. Let's see how that works, right? There were a lot of people that were skeptical and concerned about it, but the majority of them just didn't care. Like even, we went around, I think it was DevCon 4. And, I remember meeting with some of the people who were like big holders of the token, and they were kind of like, whatever. Like, do what you want. I don't care. Like everyone's wrecked. Like they're wrecked. The market's wrecked. They're just like, there's an element of like, sure, And so I do think that for a project that is still, has a lot of momentum in terms of like engineering effort, and they're like still really trying things, I would say my advice would be like, don't be afraid to do crazy shit, right? Like people will absolutely be open to that much more so than you might imagine, right? Like the people who are left in crypto today are not cautious people, right? They are very open to crazy stuff, right? So I think like, the range of possibilities of what you can do as a project, even with decentralized governance, it is not hard to convince a bunch of degens to try something crazy. Like, don't be afraid to like, come up with a crazy pivot and throw it out to the community and see what they say.
Do you think that's why, I mean, I guess in my head, there's an assumption that like bear markets tend to create much more interesting products, which may or may not be true. So I guess, first of all, do you think that's true? And second, I wonder if that's correlated to the like, just fuck around and find out energy of a bear market.
I think it's true in the sense that like whatever, so I think it's true for a number of reasons. One, in a bull market, it's like copy everyone as quickly as you can, right? And there's so many clones and like Me Too things, and just there's a lot of that stuff, right? That's happening, and so you end up with like 58 AMMs, right? With like slightly different features or whatever, like 50 different lending markets, and someone sees compound, they're like, oh, I can do compound with this tweak, right? You end up with way too many stable coins. And so I think that like that is just a feature of bull markets, that people are rushing as fast as they can to try and, put out a bucket from this money that's raining from the sky, right? And, it's easier to convince an investor to give you money for a new algo stable coin than it is for some like novel idea. Like by the time you've finished explaining it to them, they're distracted, they're running off to something else, right? And so, okay, fine. You're left at the end of a bull market with a bunch of people who hopefully still have some money left in the bucket, right? And are realizing that their, kind of, 58th AMM design or, lending marketplace or whatever is like not going to, be sufficiently differentiated for anyone to care about it. Go do something else. Like figure something else out, right? Pivot and do something else. Be like, oh, actually, it turns out we don't need 85 lending markets. Let's go and do something else. And so, when you look at what the something else is, you also have this kind of, I guess, rubble that's just littering the landscape, right? All of these things were built, some of which were good, most of which no one was paying attention to, especially if it was like not an obvious thing, right? And you end up with like a bunch of things. And, I've been finding this even recently where I've got specific things that I'm trying to solve in this new, like project that I'm building within the Synthetix ecosystem. And kind of everywhere I look, someone solved that problem. Like someone in this crazy, bull run saw that problem and decided to try and solve it. And I never heard about them, right? But then, if they're still there and it still makes sense, they're doing it. And so, I'm finding a bunch of tools that are super useful for the thing that I'm trying to build for the specific problem, because a lot of people had those problems, but they were just not the obvious thing to do. And so I think that out of that, you have a whole bunch of people that will, realize that this, let's call it an account abstraction tool or whatever, is super useful, right? And that they want to improve the UX of their product that already has some product market fit and is kind of working, but has some friction, right? And so out of the rubble, people find this little, gem of a project, right? And they're like, wow, this is super useful. And then, people start using it, get some momentum. And then out of the next bull market, that thing becomes a huge thing, right? And, there's things like 1inch, where it was like, oh, an aggregator. Like, no, they couldn't even raise money, right? They were funded by like grants from Synthetix during the bear market, right? Like no one would give those guys money. And then in the bull market, it kind of ran up and they were able to raise some money. But, the really good stuff oftentimes is ignored for a while until, it really demonstrates utility.
That is kind of funny because it's almost like we go from just like an insane amount of hype for random projects in a bull. And then in a bear, you almost have to like, and I think this is probably especially true for people who came in the bull and then are sort of staying in the bear. Like you almost have to develop your own opinion about what you think is actually valuable, because crypto Twitter is not hyping up projects like it used to.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's almost like up to each individual to figure out what's actually interesting and exciting, whether it's in like DeFi or consumer infrastructure or wherever. Definitely feels like
I would argue
there's
that skill set would have probably held you pretty well in the bull market as well if you thought to develop it, right? It seems like you can just kind of follow the crowd, right, in a bull market, and you kind of can if your only kind of metrics number go up, right? But in terms of like what's actually useful, Aptos, I don't know, probably not, right? Whatever crazy thing people were shilling in the bull market, so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious more broadly, like when we think about what it looks like to actually like maintain conviction in a bear, I'm curious what that looks like for you, because it definitely feels like crypto Twitter is kind of boring right now, except for, I don't know, there are some things happening and there's definitely like crypto Twitter drama, which can be fun to follow, but the energy is quite different. And so I'm curious how you think about that.
So someone mentioned how boring crypto Twitter has been recently. A few days ago, however it was. But here, like this, and just as we started talking earlier in the podcast, you kind of threw that question out to me, and it's been percolating in the back of my head. And I feel like here's the reason why crypto Twitter is better in a bear market. Yes, it's more boring, but we're all paying attention to the same things at the same time. In a bull market, it really fragments, right? Like there's so much stuff going on that people are paying attention to different little pockets and stuff's going on. And so like I can meet someone in crypto and be like, hey, what about this thing? And they're like, what the fuck are you talking about, right? Because they're just in a different little niche, like we saw that with NFTs, where there was a whole NFT thing where like the average NFT person would come up to me and be like, what do you think about ladies? And I'm like, what are you, but now, and like that happened, right? People like, oh, like I remember, one of my close friends being like, oh my God, I went to this like crazy event for this, new thing called Miladies. And I was like, oh, sure, whatever. And I just went back to what I was doing because just so much stuff going on that you can't. And so I think that the noise floor drops, right? And most of the people are gone. And the people who are left are all kind of part of this same club, right? And this happened in 2019. Like everyone in crypto who was in crypto knew about 1inch. Like, it was a whole, like there was DexAg and there was 1inch and there were a couple of other aggregators and they were in this like life and death battle, like this pitch battle. They hated each other, right? And they were like trolling each other constantly. And like everyone knew about that drama. We were all watching this thing, right? We're all in like this one DeFi Telegram channel and it was hilarious, right? And, I remember being a moderator and I had to like ban Sergey like 3 times from the chat because he was trolling Scott Lewis so hard and Scott Lewis would get so angry. And he was a mod, but he didn't want to ban him because he was like, it's not fair as a mod to like ban this guy. But they would just come in and they were just absolute assholes to everyone. And it was hilarious, right? But like we all knew about this. It was all like this little club that we were in, right? And so I think you end up, and this is kind of feels like what's forming now, where like, if you were to talk to someone who's still on crypto Twitter, the topic of the day, everyone knows. So we all have this shared context where we feel a sense of like, oh, we're all in this together again, right? We're not all running off in different directions. And so I think that out of that, there's a thing that kind of forms where, even obviously, crypto Twitter is much bigger today than it was back in 2019. But like out of that, you kind of form this like bond with the people who are still here where like you all have the same shared dumb memes and stories and stuff. And, you come out of that and that kind of, sees you through the next cycle.
It definitely feels like high school in a way, in a good way sometimes.
Yeah. Like, but you all know the same in jokes and the same stuff, right? Like, someone said this crazy thing and everyone knows about it, right? Because there's just not as much going on. And so again, I think that creates a sense of like camaraderie and cohesiveness in the ecosystem. Even if you're disagreeing with people, you still know what we're all disagreeing about, right?
Yeah, totally. I feel like to me, that's like, there are like several layers of like the weird shift that's happening in a bear market and what that looks like on crypto Twitter. That to me is like the middle layer where it's like the social sort of implications. I'm curious, a layer below that, when you think about like your own individual conviction, that's the other element where it's like easy to watch the drama back and forth. The layer below is like, why are we doing what we're doing?
Why are we doing this? Yeah.
What the fuck's going on?
The drama? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah. So it feels to me, and I can really only speak to my personal experience, right? But it feels to me like as you go through a cycle, especially in the bull market, it can be really frustrating to just watch the level of like nonsense, right? And so someone who had conviction in the bear market who was like, okay, like I think that this stuff is going to work, right? And so you go back to like a lot of the DeFi people were like, holy shit, like we have contracts on Ethereum, they work, they're connected to each other. We've got, arbitrage that's going on, across all of these different contracts and they're working. We have composability, like all of this stuff that was very theoretical became real in like 2018 and 2019. And so we I think, developed that conviction that like, this is real. Like we had a belief, but then we got conviction that like, this is real, right? And then the rest of the world kind of realized it. And then, the rest of the world was like, well, actually, what I'm going to do is deploy a fork of that on BSC, right? And you're like, wait, what? Sorry, what's happening? Like, and then like all of a sudden there's all this crazy, and you're just like, oh man, like this is not what I signed up for. And then it fades back down and it kind of comes back down into a bear market again. And a lot of that stuff disappears because it was, just froth from the bull markets. And I think you then need to like look around and be like, okay, we didn't necessarily get it right. We got some things wrong, right? What were the things that we got wrong? And what do we do now to position ourselves so that, in the next cycle, things are going to work? And for me, that's been the last like 3 months, really, like 3 to 6 months of thinking about it. And I've come to a pretty strong conclusion of what I think is missing, right? And I think for the majority of it is just UX issues, right? I think that we even through this whole cycle really haven't been able to compete with centralized services, right? And so when you get a whole bunch of new people pouring in, the easiest way that they can be onboarded is the way that they'll likely be onboarded, right? And so, for a big part of this cycle, that was FTX, right? That was the easiest way to onboard someone, right? Turns out that was not a great way to onboard new users, right? And so it's beholden on us to go, okay, we have all this cool stuff, right? But it's really fucking hard to use. And now we have even cooler stuff, but it's even harder to use because it's trapped on Arbitrum and Optimism. And, Base maybe will bridge that gap a little bit for us, because Coinbase obviously can pour users at something. But like, we have all this really cool stuff, even cooler than we had in 2019, because now we've got, fast networks to build stuff that requires fast execution. Okay, cool. So then what do we do? Like people still didn't really use it. It's really cool, but it didn't really get that critical mass necessarily, right? And I think the answer is that we don't really have like user experience parity with centralized services. We've always had this weird thing going on in crypto where like the majority of people are using centralized services in this ostensibly decentralized environment. Like the whole point is building centralized things, and we just wrap these layers of centralization on it, and people get wrecked because of it. It's like kind of insane. But at some point you have to look at that and be like, this is a thing we're not going to be able to overcome. Like people are not going to suddenly wake up and care about decentralization as they're pouring in the door, screaming, with their hair on fire, right? They're not going to like stop and just like take it and be like, wait a second, this thing feels a bit sketchy, this like centralized service, right? Like that's not going to happen. And as much as we, hope that it will, like we end up with more people who do care about decentralization who are left at the end of a cycle, but it's not enough, and it won't do anything when the new people start pouring back in again. And so my sense is that like really, and it's not like this is, crazy, idea, right? That no one's ever thought of, but I really strongly believe that absent feature parity in terms of the user experience and onboarding, that people are just not going to use these services, even if we get better, like that's the key thing that's missing. It's actually not even the services themselves, it's the onboarding process and how do you get them there? And so I guess probably what's happened for me, my conviction is like people will use these services, we just need to let them use them, right? And building them and hoping that they will care about decentralization has not worked. So we got to try something else. Let's try to meet them where they live, and just get to that same level of onboarding ease as say Binance has, right? And that's not easy, and it's going to require trade-offs. But if you can do it, then when people turn up and they go through the big crypto door, and there's all these other doors, and one's Binance and one is Synthetix, some Synthetix ecosystem project, right? You want the doors to be the same size. You don't want one to be this like tiny little mouse hole they've got to squeeze themselves through, and Binance is this escalator that, just takes them off a cliff and then they just, slowly fall over, right? Like you need to make sure that when they get there, that those things are equal.
Yeah. So I guess just to like follow up on that, do you think that if onboarding was like optimal, like it was as easy to, start using Synthetix on Optimism as it was for people to like use Binance or FTX or whatever, do you think that we would see like significantly more adoption? Like, have we built enough? And it sounds like you're implying that, but I want to ask it explicitly. Have we built enough where it's actually appealing for people if we reduce friction?
So I think we got to a point at some point in the last 2 or 3 years, right, where the decentralized services were at close enough to feature parity with centralized services. Like we hit that point at some point, right, where like Uniswap, right, is as good as a spot exchange, right? It's got trade-offs, obviously, but it's as good, right? And in some ways, it's much better. The permissionless nature means it's faster, right? And faster in a bull market is an incredible advantage. And so I think that's why Uniswap was so effective, and why people were willing to go through the onboarding friction, not of Uniswap, but of like Ethereum, creating a wallet, MetaMask, all that stuff, right? Because there was a product that was 10x better than the alternatives. And so I think that worked. I think, pardon me, I think like lending protocols in terms of like, lending in C5 versus lending, there's some challenges there because lending protocols can just, pay Ponzi fake APYs, right, and steal your money. And so that's a hard thing to compete with. But I do think that if, again, the onboarding friction was lower and you're looking at those two things, you would look at the one that's decentralized, that's really clear about what it's doing. And I think that enough people would be like, okay, this makes sense to do this thing. But when there's that additional onboarding friction versus just, type in a username and password and you're up Celsius and you can give them all your assets and, you're done, right? I think that it's hard to compete with that. I think exchanges, like particularly perps exchanges, we didn't really have the ability earlier in the cycle because we didn't have layer 2 networks to do some of the stuff and compete from a feature perspective with a database, right? But I think we can actually compete with a database to an extent that the average user is not going to care about the difference. And so I do really think that we passed that inflection point at some point, but we had been so busy building the infrastructure, building, all of this stuff, that the onboarding process was kind of, I say this all the time, right? Like you don't put customers into a leaky funnel, right? I said this for years and years, right? Like people would be like, why don't you market Synthetix more? And I'm like, because the product market fit for Synthetix is staking. And staking is a nightmare, and only a bunch of degens would be willing to do it. But there's good product market fit for staking, right? There are a ton of degens with, who are willing to do this thing. Great. The average user is not going to be a staker in Synthetix, right? But the average user could be a trader at Synthetix, but we don't have a good trading experience. So going out and advertising and pushing people in this funnel where they're just falling out the other side is not a good idea. But we now finally do have a trading experience that competes with Binance, and FTX in particular. And it has a really nice additional feature, which is that we don't steal your money, which it turns out is a pretty powerful feature, right? So
pretty awesome.
It's a pretty good feature, not stealing people's money, right? So, so I think that like we passed that point and we got to a point where it's like, okay, wow, we need to actually get people to use this thing. And then it's like, okay, we're going to get people to use it. How? Because it's still really hard to get them to use it. Like the actual process of onboarding them is really hard. And, yes, we can educate people. And I think that will happen over time. But the reality is that there are a lot of things we can do to make the onboarding process better. And I think that this is my assumption for this cycle, right, is if we can solve the onboarding problem, right, and we already have feature parity in terms of, the infrastructure that we built, we can solve the onboarding problem, that we can make it equally likely or even more likely that someone will go to a decentralized service if we do that, right? Now, maybe that assumption will be wrong. And, we get to a bull market, it turns out no one cares. And for some reason, they'll want to go to Binance no matter what you do. But my assumption right now is that they don't care about Binance. They care about getting on a service as quickly as possible and having the features that they want. And if you make all things equal, the features that they want will be hopefully to not have their money stolen. They will understand that that is a feature that is valuable and they will use it. They're just not willing to use that if they have to jump through 50 hoops to get to that feature.
Yeah, I think, I mean, not stealing users' money is definitely a solid value prop. But
Yeah.
also, something that I feel like in the last bull market, we kind of conflated as like a benefit of being a user and using decentralized services was this idea of like being involved in governance. That like, oh, well, not only can you use this protocol, but also you can have a say in how it's run, and you don't get that in FTX or Binance or whatever. I don't know that I actually think that that is fully true, especially in a context of something like a DeFi protocol where like your users are not necessarily your token holders who are active in governance. And so I'm curious how you think about that in the context of what it looks like to have these like sort of benefits of decentralized services, and if that's even valuable for users or if that's sort of a different domain entirely.
So, how do people find out about things, right? Influencers on Twitter. That's kind of how they find out about things. And, what do influencers shill? Some will shill things that are, just generally good, right? Because they like them, Uniswap pre-token, right? The average person who was talking about Uniswap on crypto Twitter had no exposure to Uniswap. Maybe they were an LP, right? Maybe like it kind of benefited them because they're already LPing. And so, more volume would be good for them, right? But that's not, the most direct alignment, financial alignment, right? Whereas with a lot of exchanges, you had these referral programs where, the more people they refer, they were getting, fees and kickbacks and rebates and all kinds of things, right? So the alignment was much more direct, I guess, right? And so I suppose when we sort of ask the question of like, how are people going to find out about things in the next cycle, right? You want to make sure that the people who have the potential to expose people to new projects are aligned with them. And so I think that those are like the mavens and, the people that are, sometimes deeply researched. Sometimes they're just, like shills on Twitter that have somehow accumulated a lot of followers, right? By saying incendiary things or whatever they're doing, right? I guess that's my playbook as well, so I shouldn't not too much. But like, you have the ability for these people who are kind of introducing new users to the ecosystem, to projects, for them to have governance power and exposure to the project itself, right? In a way that, is, I would argue, significantly better than just a referral program, right? And so if you, as an influencer, see this new project, new exchange or new lending protocol, and you can hold tokens in it and govern it and help to like drive it, that total buy-in that you have is going to make your conviction that this is a good thing for you to be talking about, much higher. And so I think that is an advantage that we have. But and again, this comes back to this assumption, right, of onboarding, right? Like, so you have this influencer who is a delegate in, Compound or something like that, right? And, they've been working, closely to like make sure Compound is really good and, does all this stuff, right? And they're talking about it. And then someone comes across this person on Twitter and sees them talking about Compound. And they're like, oh, Compound looks cool. How do I use it? And they turn up to Compound and they're like, oh, MetaMask, this, that, whatever. Meanwhile, there's someone else who's shilling Celsius, right? And the person turns up and they're like, username, password, take all my money. Thanks very much. I'm done, right? It's just hard to compete with that. But if we can get to a point where we close that gap, right, then, maybe we can shift some of those new users as they come into decentralized services. But it has to be easy. And this, again, like this has been a thing we've been talking about for 5 years in the Ethereum ecosystem, that like onboarding is really tough, wallet UX, account abstraction, like this is a thing. But I think we're finally at a point where we've solved the underlying issue, right? Like if you go and solve account abstraction and onboarding and everything and do that first, and then people turn up and it's a ghost town, well, you're not going to keep them, right? But we've got a bustling city that we built on these L2s that are actually working, that's fast and useful and it has all these cool features. We just need a way to get them there as efficient as possible.
Interesting. And so actually, like in a way, some of the mechanisms for getting people there could be governance token, leveraging governance tokens in some way, where you actually have people who are like large holders of governance tokens sort of bringing people in and being like
100%.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting.
Because users are not going to govern, the average user is probably not going to govern the protocol, right?
Yeah.
That said, why does the average user turn up to crypto in a bull market? Because they want exposure to things that will go up. Like it's speculation, realistically, right? Like that's what drives the majority of attention. And then eventually some people are like, oh, wow, this is really cool. I'm going to stay, right? And it's not just speculation. But I think that has the potential to be quite a powerful thing. And I think it worked in DeFi summer, where there were new users who were coming not from outside of crypto, but from like within the crypto sphere. Maybe they were like into Ripple weirdly or like whatever, right? And they were like, oh, wow, like this thing actually works. And then they start buying, tokens in Compound or, some other project, right? Or Maker or whatever. And like they get really bought in and they're like, no, okay, this is my ecosystem now. I do think we converted some people who were, just crypto speculators into like, holy shit, this thing works. And it's working over here in the Ethereum ecosystem. This is the deal. So I think that can work for a subset of users, that, they can get exposure to things that they're actually using. And this works for exchanges, right? Like FTT. There are a lot of people that were using FTX because they had the token. They bought the token because they believed in it, or BNB or whatever. They're using fucking Binance Smart Chain because they hold BNB, right? That there couldn't really be much of, I shouldn't say that. I used to say that all the time. There was a reason why people were using Binance Smart Chain, because low fees. And because low fees, was a big deal because high fees on Ethereum, it was too expensive to use Ethereum at the time. And they wanted to use something that had smart contracts that allowed them to do all this stuff. And they went to Binance Smart Chain because it was super cheap. Now, the trade-off is that it's totally centralized, right? But they don't care about that, right? And so, but again, that was an unsolved problem. We've solved that problem. This cycle, we solved it. You don't need to go to BSC because we have Polygon and we have, like other, we've got like ZK stuff coming out. We've got layer twos like Arbitrum and Optimism. Like we've got an ecosystem that will allow us, especially with 4844, hopefully we'll get fees down even lower. You won't need to go to BSC because the delta between, the 0 cent BSC fee and a 1 cent Optimism fee is just not enough to move the dial for the average person. They're just going to go and use the place that's better, that has more interesting novel stuff and not a bunch of clone projects.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, you mentioned like the assumption around, if we make UX better, we've actually built enough where people will come. I'm curious, what other assumptions or hypotheses are you building right now that are not validated, but that feel potentially true?
I think one of them is sort of a sub-assumption, right? Which is that it's okay to make some centralization trade-offs, right, in onboarding. Because we're already making centralization trade-offs in our like L2s, for example, right? Like we've got, centralized sequencers. We're working on that. It's a problem we're trying to fix, right? There have always been elements of centralization in the Ethereum ecosystem. Let's ignore crypto as a whole, right? And just talk about Ethereum. There have always been elements of centralization, and there has always been a push and a drive to remove those over time, right? And to improve decentralization over time. And I think that we've stayed committed to that, both as individual projects and as a wider community, and we've done a really good job of it. But I think that for some reason, or in like some aspects of things, we're really scared to like introduce any aspect of centralization, right? And I mean, I'll give it a good example from the history of Synthetix, right? We were probably one of the first big projects to not just have proxy contracts there and pretend like they weren't there, but to actually come out and say, we have proxy contracts and here's why we're using them and this is why we think it's a good idea, right? Because we have no fucking idea what we're doing. And if we build this immutably, it would like work for 2 weeks and then we'd have to shut it down, right? So we need proxy contracts because we're still trying to figure out what this thing does. So we built them, and oh my God, if you like go on Reddit and like dredge up those old threads about proxy contracts, like, Haven's the biggest scam in history. They can change the contracts on you and do all this stuff. And eventually built this very robust infrastructure to manage those proxy contracts. Like we built a governance infrastructure and a whole bunch of things, and we did fix that problem. But I think that there is hesitancy to centralize certain things, right, that haven't been centralized before. And, luckily I don't have much hesitancy to do things if I think it's a good idea. And so, my thesis is that if we centralize some of the onboarding processes and make them much easier by having trade-offs, that those trade-offs will be worth it and we can eventually remove those trade-offs. But let's not, be like decentralization maximalists in the most important place that we need to be, which is the user funnel, right? Like, let's build a good funnel and then figure out how to decentralize it, not let's build a decentralized funnel that is a piece of shit. And so that for me is like, that's the sub thesis of like, let's onboard people, and I'm willing to make the trade-offs, that are needed to get there.
Interesting. So really, like, the piece of also tangible advice there would basically be over-index on centralization where necessary, or lean towards it, and then trust that you can decentralize things later, so long as, like, companies, for example, aren't building moats on the centralized sort of process, which obviously then disincentivizes decentralization. But, like, very tactically speaking, there's actually something there around pushing for more centralization, and over-indexing on it, and then just trusting later that will sort of be fixed.
I think this is, yes, like fundamentally yes, right? And I think that this is the problem. There are two types of people who will centralize things, right? There's the type of person who wants to steal your money, right? And then there's the type of person who wants to make the best product with the tools they have at the time, right?
Right.
And you can't know the difference between the two of them, right? Now, if you know in yourself as a builder that you're doing this for the right reasons with the intent of decentralizing it over time, and you're willing to take the pain of people saying you're going to steal my money, right? Then you can do that and it can be quite effective. And this is like one of the things that Synthetix did, right? People are like, you will never decentralize governments. You're a monster. You're just a dictator and, whatever, right? Like, and like, there's no argument against that because it is centralized, right? Like, we've centralized governance right now. So there's no way for me to like point to the future and be like, no, I really will do this. I will give up power, right? But now it'd be like, you look back in hindsight, and I gave up, in some cases, maybe too much power, right? But I did the thing. And again, I think this is where like you have to have conviction that you genuinely are going to do this, right? And that you are seriously committed to it. And it's so easy to lose sight of it. There were so many times where even the community was like, don't do this. This is going to be such a pain in the ass. Like, don't do SIPs, right? Like, come on. Like, let's just vote in Discord, right? And you're like, no, like, this is the thing. We committed to it. We got to do this thing. We're going to keep decentralizing. And really it requires like a hard push to continue to decentralize because processes ossify really quickly and people are like, nope, this is the way we do it and I like doing it this way, and you're making it harder and you're bad, right? It's like, wait a second, like we like all agreed we're going to decentralize it. We have to do this, right? And so I think that as a builder, if you're sitting here right now and you're like, I could build something that's 10x better, but I don't have the tools to do the 10x better thing in a decentralized way now. But if I build it, I can backfill decentralization later and fix it. Go and fucking do that. Like, go and do that and just have the conviction that you will do it and then actually do it and decentralize it. And you will have a thing that is so much more useful, later through that process than if you have this hard line, no, it has to be decentralized now. And the trade-off here is that some people will not want to engage with that. And that's good, right? Like, we don't want people to engage with centralized things where they can have their money stolen. But there will be a certain class of people that either will believe you for whatever reason and believe that you are on that path, right? And will have the conviction to go and use the thing, or that are degens that don't care, right? And they're like, yeah, steal my money, I don't care, right? Everyone's stealing my money. What's the big deal, right? And then when you don't, they're going to be like, oh, wow, that's cool. I was really expecting you were going to steal my money and you didn't. Okay, like, what are we doing now, right? Like, and so, I think that there will be people who will still be willing to engage with you, but there will be a lot of people that will say, like, this is bad. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. You're a monster. And you just have to have the conviction that you're working towards not being a monster, I guess.
Yeah. Did you ever last question before we wrap. Did you ever have a moment where you were like, I'm not going to do this. Like, this is so much more work than it's worth. We might as well just keep down our path.
You know what? I think the thing for me that was kind of my North Star when it came to decentralization is I knew that we were doing stuff that was going to be problematic from a regulatory perspective, right? Like eventually, if it worked, regulators were going to have some questions about this because it doesn't fit into an easy regulatory box, right? It's so novel that you can't just be like, oh, well, this rule obviously applies to it, right? There is really no rule that specifically applies to what Synthetix is doing. And so I was like, when we get to that point, when we build something that is sufficiently good enough that regulators care enough to try and regulate it and figure out what this thing is, I do not want to be the person that is in control of this thing when that happens, right? And so I was just like, I don't like, it's not worth it to me, right? Like, it's not worth it to me to maintain this grip on power, right? And so but at the same time, I was very concerned that if we just handed over governance without any thought to how it was going to work, that it would not work and we wouldn't be able to get there. So, there's a tension there, right? It's like, well, I kind of see a path here, but I need to be able to put in place a process to allow us to get there where I can still have input in the system without being in control of it. And that, there's this marketplace of ideas and I can be one of the participants that I can, agitate for what I think is right. And a lot of times what I thought was right was wrong. And the community chose something else and I'm glad they did, right? But really for me, it was like, I do not want any one person, whether it's me or my successor or whatever, to be in control of this thing when it works. No one has to be in control of this when it works. When it works, we don't want anyone in control. We want to be able to just look around there and be like, I don't know who's doing this thing, right? It's doing itself. And that's where we're at now. Like, no one is in control of Synthetix at this point. It just does its own thing and it's kind of self-organizing and it has the right incentives to get humans to keep working on it, but it is its own thing. It's its own entity that will keep going regardless of me or anyone else.
That does feel like a silver lining of all of the regulatory ambiguity of just like, it's kind of forcing everyone's hand in terms of decentralization.
In principle, yeah, but like some people are still not getting it, right? Like,
yes.
It's like, read the room, people. Like, you really need to do this. Like, this is not a joke anymore. Like, you need to decentralize. Like, and I've been saying this for a long time, right? Like, I remember getting up on stage. I think it was like mainnet. It was the mainnet where Dope One got subpoenaed. And I was like, guys, like, we don't get to have entities anymore. I know you were like kind of feeling like you got, maybe an entity in like the Seychelles was going to be okay. I was like, no more entities. You don't get to have a Swiss foundation. Like the game of having an entity that runs your project is over. And people were like, you're insane. And I was like, no, look at what, like, you can see the trajectory this is going, right? And now we look back on them, we're like, oh, wow. Now, of course, there's other, there's people who still have entities who are somehow not in jail, right? And they're obviously doing something right. But I think for the majority of projects, like, having entities just puts a target on your back, right? And so, we don't have entities. Synthetix doesn't have an entity. It has a set of contracts on mainnet and on, Optimism that does stuff. The end.
Hopefully that becomes the case for a lot more projects over the next couple of years.
Let's hope so.
See what ends up happening. We'll see what Gary Gensler decides is acceptable, or maybe someone else. But that's a whole other story. Kain, this was so wonderful. I so appreciate you sharing a bunch of different things just in terms of building in a bear market and dealing with all of the craziness. Where can people learn more about Synthetix? I know V3 is sort of a big thing within the ecosystem. And where can people learn more about you?
Yeah, I think someone's going to be upset with me for not talking about V3 enough here. But anyway, I'm sure you can find out V3. No, like, it's funny because like even yesterday I was like, the way that I talk about V3 versus the way that like the marketing people talk about V3, I'm like, look, it's just the same thing but better. And they're like, you can't say that. Like, that's not like, and I'm like, but it's the truth. Like, we built a bunch of contracts that had a bunch of nonsense code that didn't do anything, and we've taken it all out and like looked at like how it works and made it better. And it does some cooler stuff that we couldn't do with the old contracts, like permissionless markets, whatever. But fundamentally, it's like take 5 years of writing the wrong thing and eventually getting to the right thing and just like put it back together properly. So yeah, I think like Synthetix Discord is probably the best place. It's the best place to talk about stuff. If you're curious, is always someone in there who's willing to answer your questions. And then, you can just follow me on Twitter if you're brave enough.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was so wonderful.